Welcome to another episode of Reflections. I'm your host, Patrick Tomlinson. And today it gives me great pleasure in welcoming a very distinguished guest, Professor Norma Fuentes-Mayorga. Professor Fuentes is a professor in the sociology department at the City College of New York. Her educational background encompasses obtaining a BA in sociology and economics from Columbia University in 1989. She went on to achieve the MA in sociology and Latin American studies, again at Columbia University. And in 2005, she received her PhD in sociology from Columbia University. Her major dissertation was on Dominicans and Mexicans in New York City, gender realization and work incorporation. Professor Fuentes specializes in Latin American studies and is interested in and concentrates on the areas of international migration and education as it relates to the U.S. Latin American and Latin American studies sector. She looks at racializations, housing, mental health, and has postdoctoral specializations in international migration, comparative education, race, ethnicity, and development in Latin America. Welcome, Professor Fuentes.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and talk to us, to explore some of these very weighty and meaty issues. Okay, so Professor, tell us a little bit about, your background, where you grew up, how it influenced you, how it led you into this distinguished field.
Thank you, Patrick. This is really an honor. When you asked me to participate in the show and you asked me to speak about my life and what has influenced me to become a professor or dedicate myself to advocate for immigrants in the U.S., which is how I see it in two sentences. I thought that it will take a whole afternoon to do this, right? Because I've never been giving an interview just to speak about me. So this is an honor. Thank you. I usually tell my students a little bit about me, but mostly to have them see my humanity, right? To see that there's a lot in common between me and them. But among the people, how do I start? Among the people who have influenced me the most to want to do well in life, to move up, not to be poor, but not so much to be poor, but to have others see me with respect. That's what my grandmother's mantra was, like, please make sure others will see you and respect you, and make sure that you don't have to do this, every 2 weeks when your husband come home, meaning that you don't have to ask him to support you financially, that you can fend for yourself. My grandmother was a widow herself, and she grew up in a very humble area in the Dominican Republic, in the mountains, and she was born there, as well as her maternal and paternal descendants, and my mother was born there, and I was born there. In fact, in the same bed where my mother was born, I was born, I hear. So my grandmother was a big influencer as to wanting to study and to be someone that made my family proud and that helped society also, because I grew up in a Christian home. My grandmother was Christian because her husband was a minister in a small little rural area where the average level of education was like a third grade. But my grandfather dedicated his life since the age of 14 to helping evangelize, but also help feed and educate his little rural top mountain community. And, he died when my grandmother was 28. My mother was 9, so we grew up in a family led by my grandmother and also by the principles instilled in me as a Christian. So, in other words, my grandmother was the first, and then other mentors, right? My uncles and aunties with whom I grew up with and who shaped my soul and my life. And then here, once we migrated to New York at the age of 14, I came to live in Yonkers, away from a Latino or Black community. I came to live in a working class, white ethnic community known for its industrial park. And in here, I made friends with, I became a Puerto Rican, right, by default, because people were only familiar with Latinos who were Puerto Rican or Mexican. And in the East Coast, you know, it's mostly Puerto Rican who had settled the Bronx and most of the East Coast, and then the Cubans, right? But the poor experience was associated with Puerto Ricans. So people always thought that we were Puerto Ricans. And my friends were mostly Puerto Ricans and some of them Italian, working class, working origins. So then I found mentors in high school. I had a mentor, and then my first husband, because I've been married twice. So my first husband was a community leader, a Puerto Rican man, community leader. And I met him while I worked in my first job as a community little tiny receptionist in the first Latino organization in the community of Yonkers that helped and serviced immigrants.
What was it called?
Say that again. It was called the Hispanic Foundation. The Hispanic Foundation in Yonkers. It was the first migrant organization to be established, and it was led by a Jesuit priest and my ex-husband, Fernando Fuentes, after whom, to honor him, I kept the name, and also to honor our first daughter. And so then being working in an organization and seeing his work and seeing the advocacy done for the education and literacy and empowerment of Latinos gave me my first lesson. Actually, my second lesson, my first lesson in helping others was through my grandmother, because she wouldn't eat. Like, she was a widow and we lived with very little resources, and she wouldn't allow us to eat until we went to deliver food to the neighbor next door who had a baby, or the person who had lost their job, and then we were allowed to eat. So my second lesson as a sociologist was with my first husband and his dedication for the community. He's been a hero. In fact, he was the first Latino to receive, to be part of the Board of Education, to be a trustee member of the Board of Education. And he resigned from that positions in the late 80s to place a legal suit against the city of Yonkers for its history of discrimination and segregation of Latinos. And as a result, Yonkers became the second Supreme case of desegregation in the United States, where the city is mandated by the Supreme Court in the late 1980s, early 90s, to desegregate schools and neighborhoods. And so my ex-husband is responsible, and a group of thinkers and brave people like him were able to, is the reason why there are public housing and schools in middle-class neighborhoods in Yonkers. And I don't know if you want me to stop, but there are other
Go ahead.
There are other mentors in college. Like when I was in high school, Patrick, I wanted to become a doctor, and I attended a public high school in Yonkers. And I remember the guidance counselor, when the time came to fill out my application for college, this middle-aged, about my age now, white man, he asked me, "So you want to go to medical school?" Okay, very nice. And he used to call me sweetie and sweetheart all the time. And he says, "Sweetie, who's going to pay for that?"
Was that offensive for you at that time? Did you find that offensive at that time?
No, not at all. Not at all. I came at 14. I was 16, 17. I thought he was being sweetie. He was treating me like dear, like endearment. But now in retrospect, I'm thinking like,
right.
It's not the sweetie. It's what he said. He said, "Who's going to pay for that? Do you have money to pay for that? To go to medical school? No, right? So you need to learn how to type. You need to go to a secretarial school and learn how to type." And he did me a favor in retrospect, because I typed my way through my bachelor's degree, through my master, through my second master's, through my PhD. I work, as I told you yesterday when we were talking, that I went in at the age of 19. I entered Columbia University as a transfer student from Fordham, as a pre-medical student, because I managed to go and enter the pre-medical program. And I left at the age of 42 with 4 degrees, a new husband who I met there, another Latino person of color, yes, and then and 3 more daughters. So I joke and I tell my students, I ask them, guess how many degrees it takes to do a PhD? And then I said, if you guess, I can tell you that for each degree, I have a daughter. And that every time I became a mother, I was either by fear or by more wisdom, I said, I need to continue my school. And so I owe Columbia and my two husbands that I love and feel very proud of, that they are my family, because we're still very friends with my first husband. We invite him to dinner, and we have a daughter in common that my second husband has helped raise. So I owe Columbia University, and my husband, right, and my grandmother. Now that you ask me who has influenced me, who has supported me, right, and my auntie and my uncles, and my professor, Herbert Gans at Columbia University, who met me when I was 20 years old and continued to be a mentor until I got my PhD. I owe to all of them my ascendancy.
Okay, so what drove you to study sociology and economics?
Right, sociology, because I told you I had my first experience working in a community organization, right? The Hispanic Foundation of Yonkers. That was when I got my first experience. I had just obtained a typing degree, a 2 years associate degrees at a small college where my public high school recommended me. It's called Elizabeth Seton College here in Yonkers, headed by the Elizabeth Seton section of nuns, right? So I got a scholarship and I got a degree for 2 years, an associate degree in business and executive secretarial. And I got my first executive secretarial in the Spanish Foundation. And like I said, looking at the work they did in advocacy and education and summer youth camp for the poor Latinos and helping immigrants with their citizenship and their papers, that gave me this interest in doing a career, a profession that will help me help my my community.
Okay. So there is a lot of influence from family and your own situation in prompting you or encouraging you to take on sociology. What was it like coming from your experience to Columbia University, and what were some of the obstacles that you faced or challenges or
Yes, good question.
How did that happen?
Yes. Good question. I just finished giving a talk to a new entering class, a student at City College, about how paradoxical it was that I was at Columbia, which is only 5 minutes by car or walking 10, 15 minutes, right, from City College, that in my graduate studies, the place that I came for mentoring and for emotional and psychological support was at City College, because I volunteer as a graduate student at City College. I volunteered through the Dominican Studies Institute. We had been, which is the first and the only one I understand in the nation, and it's housed at City College. And I learned about it. I don't remember how. I think one of my professors recommended me from Columbia, Professor Gans probably. And I went to volunteer and I became involved in helping establish the first youth conference in the year 2000, and also to help kids, college kids, fill out their application for PhD or advanced degrees program. And one of those students was Junot Diaz. Junot Diaz, the famous
the
writer. Yes, yeah. He was one of the students with whom I work, helping mentor and helping them fill out the application for graduate school.
Okay.
So I used to come to Columbia. So working at Columbia, yes, I was somewhat, Patrick, in a unique position because I used to work as a secretary for the chair of sociology. I came at 19, and I remember my ex-husband then, who was very oriented about community resources, telling me, apply for a job, even if it is sweeping or doing anything, just take it. Just be inside, because you will get tuition assistance if you work there. Okay. And that was like one of the best advice, because I worked there. And so working full-time, Patrick, gave me a different experience. I was like an insider outsider, because I changed from pre-medicine to becoming a sociology minor. And then being and working in the sociology department, the secretaries and the other professors liked me, and they used to think of me as resourceful and admire me, and also probably pity me because they saw me working full time and studying at night and being a mother so young, right, at the age of 18. So they all, in a way, I think, were looking out for me.
Okay, very good.
And so yes, it was isolating in the graduate program. Hardly any student invited me to their home or made me part of their lives because I was different. I had a family. I work as a research assistant. I work as a teaching assistant, and then I took my classes, and then I ran home, right, to take care of my daughter. So it was a different experience. But I think without my family and without those professors at City College that were my mentors, or at CUNY, who were my mentors, and without Professor Gans, I would have never done it, or I wouldn't have done it so well. Yes.
Okay.
So I owe them gratitude. Yes.
Very good. Now, in the second segment, we're going to look at some of your research work, but I just wanted to sort of segue into your thesis and what you chose to specialize in, which is the area of Dominicans and Mexicans in New York City. And subtitle is Gender, Racialization, and Work Incorporation. What does that mean if we're to distill that down?
Yes, I know that's like a mouthful. And usually you don't choose the title of your doctoral thesis. Usually your mentors recommend, like, I wanted to study, for instance, I was very interested in, since I had a minor in economics as an undergraduate, I was very interested in learning and doing research about how do immigrants become entrepreneurs. You know, what allows some groups and not others to have an economic enclave, like an economic community. I see now where I grew up in South Yonkers that there is a new Mexican-owned bunch of little stores with what we call sociology's economic enclaves, right? Made out of small businesses which have developed throughout the years. I wonder why Dominicans didn't develop this in Yonkers when they were there before the Mexicans. Why didn't the Puerto Ricans develop this when they were there even before the Dominicans, right? What allows one group to become incorporated and not the others? But by the time that was my interest when I started graduate school, but by the time 4 or 5 years later, when I have finished all of my qualifying exams and I was ready to propose a study, I became more interested in the migration of Dominican women. And I noticed that women in earlier cohorts, like in the 60s, 70s, in the cohort that my mother arrived in the late 60s, 70s, and up until the 80s, that migration was pretty much family. Like husbands will come and then they will bring their wives together. But usually the husband will come in the 1950s, 60s, up until the 70s, and then they will send for their wives. In the mid 80s and in the 90s, and some sociologists and anthropologists said that no, that has been the case since the 70s. I realized more and more that women were leading the migration, right? That my mother had led her migration from a rural town in the top mountain where I told you that I was born to the periphery of the Dominican Republic, where she worked in a small little kitchenette, as the person who cuts plátanos and does the worst of jobs in the back, because she had no education. And then she married a middle-class man. She owns a little house. She puts me in private school. But then 7 years later, she discovers that the man that she loved and admired, who was also 20 years her elder, was not very loyal to her. And she valued more the love than the car that he had given her, or the house, or my private school. She valued more the love. And so she left him and came to New York and worked here. And so that experience, me having to translate for my mother in the hospital, in her jobs, everywhere she went, I was like most immigrant youth, they have to grow up very fast because they have to be the interpreter for their parents who don't speak the language. And so that too gave me another lesson about the immigrant experience. And I decided that it will be Dominican women that I will study, and on behalf of whom I will always dedicate my life. But then my mentor says, oh, do you want to be just a Dominican specialist, or do you want to be a Latin Americanist? Because your jobs and your education will be much broader. So he suggested that I do a comparison between Mexicans and Dominican women. And that advice has paid off greatly, because I have learned, and now I have a new Mexican culture. The Mexican community that I study, many of them have, invited me to their homes, share their lives, and enrich my life as a sociologist. Okay. So that's why I decided on Dominican and Mexican. And incorporation means integration to work and integration to housing. Like, how do you get a job? Where do you work? Who hires you? What kind of housing do you have? Are Dominican and Mexican similar in some ways and different in others? This is what my study documents. And I am the first, if I'm not mistaken, scholar to document and compare the migration of Mexican and Dominicans in New York City.
Okay. There's so much to drill down into, Professor. But I just want to, for the second segment, in recognition of Hispanic Heritage Month, for you to just enlighten us, those of us who are probably not as sensitized to the community as we ought to be, as to these terms. We hear them being used all around: Latino, Latina, Hispanic, Latin. Give us your understanding of these terms and how are they to be approached and used.
Thank you. Yes, it's very interesting. As I told you before, I have been asked by my college to participate in the Hispanic Heritage Month education that the college does, or actually on behalf of the Latin American and Latino Studies program, of which I was a director once for 1 year in 2015, 16, or 6, I forgot, 16, 17. And I'm also an associated faculty in the Latino Studies program. So I was asked to speak about, educating students, but also the wider community as to what are the main issues pressing the Latino community right now. And I think I will say one of those is an identity, right? Forming a new identity, because the Hispanic term, as you know, sort of lumps everyone, and it's not a racial category, it's an ethnic category. Although most people think, depending on their level of education, they think, no, that's my race and that's my, or that's my ethnicity, or that's my nationality, right?
Okay, I wanted to kind of zero in on this, because the scientists tell us that race is not it's not a scientific term.
It's not a biological.
Exactly. So just enlighten us, expand on that for us a little bit.
Yes. When I went to graduate school, you have to choose 3 specializations. And I decided to be what is called as a urban sociologist. And one of those specializations is race and ethnic and gender stratification. So you try to do studies that will educate people about the meaning of race, the meaning of gender, the meaning of ethnicity, and how and in what contexts one category is more important for you getting an education, or for you getting married, or for you getting a job. One is what your gender or your race or your ethnicity trumps or becomes more important. And so one of the things I learned in graduate school is that there were 2 debates, right? One that says your race is your skin color, your phenotype, your nose, the shape of your lips, your ears, your hair, all of that constitute your race in the United States, right? If you have 1 ounce of Black in you, which I have a lot because I am mixed with Afro-descendant population in the Caribbean, if you have 1 ounce of that in the United States, you are considered non-white. So that the white category is very valued, right? And it has a legacy, right, with slavery, right? Because one group dominated the other, and Blacks.
Yeah, something quick, Professor.
Yes.
A lot of people look at you phenotypically and say, okay, but you have embraced that part of your culture. Why is that so?
Say that question again. That a lot of the people.
I'm saying maybe a lot of people categorize you in and not putting you in another group. Exactly. But you have embraced, you have studied, and you have written about that that part of your heritage. Why is that so?
All right. You're asking me if a lot of people challenge or question my Dominican identity. Is that what you're saying?
No. I'm saying they could mistake you for somebody other than Dominican.
Exactly. Yes, for a North African, from the Middle East.
So many other Portuguese,
exactly.
Polish, etc., etc.
Yes, and we call that ambiguous identities. And I would like to talk to you about ambiguous identities and the benefits and the challenges that someone with ambiguous identities encounters in the U.S.
Okay.
Yes. Do we have time to speak about that?
Yes, we have about 3 more minutes. So maybe you can just touch upon that a little bit, and then in the second segment we'll drill.
We'll continue. I'll give you some snippets. I don't like to say bullets because I am trying to take all the violent words from this language.
Right.
But yes, so my book that's forthcoming has a chapter on ambiguous, the benefits and challenges of an ambiguous identity, and I've given a couple of presentations on this. And when does your identity as Black or as white or as ambiguous, right? The people in the middle, it's challenge or is a benefit, right? So I look at employers in service sector jobs like restaurant owners, small, restaurant, laundromats, but any service job where people have, or hair salons, for example, where people have to interact a lot with the client, right? I have found that in those contexts of work, service jobs, that an ambiguous identity usually is connected with better pay and positions dealing with the public. While if your identity is Black or indigenous, in the case of Mexican and Dominicans, that you're most likely to be put by employers in the back where you don't have much direct interaction with the client. And this also is another way of reproducing racial and class inequality, right? It's a way of sorting people by their skin color. And so I found that in some circumstances, an ambiguous identity helps immigrant Latinos like Dominicans, right, who are mostly mixed with Black, 80%. So when they can go for a mulatto or a mixed race person, that sometimes that's a benefit. But in other instances, if they are in a Black neighborhood and they're not fully accepted as one of them, that might be a liability. And who can make friendship with you or can invite you to work with them or to be part of their peer group? Yes. We have 1 minute left to say goodbye. Yeah. So,
is there anything you'd like to, in closing, just summarize for us?
So yes, that my research has been on how, like you asked me before, what does incorporation means? I've been studying for the past 15 years how employers hire small service employers, hire Dominican and Mexicans, and for what industry, for what areas, right? While Dominicans are mostly taxi drivers, like the people from India now increasingly, right? They have been dominating in that sector. And women in the hair salon, Mexicans are in other sectors. We can continue to talk about that later. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much for a mouthful, Professor. And we'll certainly look at that a second time. A splendid presentation. And we thank you ever so much for taking time out to appear on Reflections. Thank you so much.
Yes. Bye.